This is Miss Alice, and I want you to sit with something uncomfortable for a moment. You are doing everything right. You are providing. You are present. You are faithful. You are trying in ways that cost you something real. You are showing up consistently for a person and a marriage that you genuinely believe in. And she is treating you like the villain. Not occasionally. Not in moments of genuine conflict where both people lose their footing and say things they regret. Consistently, structurally, as the default setting of how she relates to you. You are the problem. You are the source of her suffering. You are the reason she cannot be happy. And no matter what you do, no matter how much you adjust or improve or accommodate, the verdict does not change. You have been tried and convicted inside a courtroom you never knew existed. And the evidence against you is entirely produced by the person running the trial. I am a woman, and I am telling you that what I just described is real. It happens in more marriages than anyone is willing to say publicly, and the men living inside it deserve to understand exactly what is happening to them before it costs them years of their lives that cannot be recovered. Today, I am going to tell you why some women who have genuinely good lives with genuinely good men cannot stop seeing themselves as victims. What that pattern is doing inside your marriage, and what it is going to keep costing you if you do not understand it clearly enough to stop participating in it. The first thing you need to understand is what victimhood provides that partnership does not. Think about what genuine accountability requires. It requires looking honestly at your own behavior, acknowledging the places where you fell short, taking real responsibility for your contribution to the problems in the relationship, sitting with the discomfort of being wrong and doing the difficult work of actually changing. That is hard. It is uncomfortable, and it never ends because being a genuine partner in a real relationship means continuous, honest self-examination across years of shared life. Now think about what victimhood provides instead. Nothing is your fault. Every problem in the relationship has a source, and the source is him. Every difficulty, every dissatisfaction, every moment of unhappiness can be pointed at him as its origin. The painful work of looking inward becomes completely unnecessary because the explanation for everything is always outward. That is not a small psychological benefit. That is an escape from one of the most demanding requirements of adult life. And the woman who has discovered that victim status provides that escape has found something that her psychology will protect with considerable force. Because giving it up means returning to a version of herself that has to look honestly at her own contribution to the life she is living. And that version of herself is significantly less comfortable than the version that is suffering nobly at the hands of an inadequate husband. The second thing to understand is what the labels are actually doing. You have been called controlling, probably more than once, maybe recently. You expressed a preference, you set a boundary, you asked a reasonable question about a shared decision. You held a position that was genuinely yours rather than yielding to her version of what should happen. And the response was controlling. I want you to understand what that label is doing because it is not describing your behavior. It is performing a specific function inside the dynamic of your marriage. The label transforms what you did from a reasonable action into evidence of a character flaw, serious enough to justify how she is treating you in return. If you are controlling, then she does not need to engage with your position. She does not need to consider whether your preference or boundary or question was reasonable. She does not need to be accountable for her own behavior that produced the conflict. She just needs to apply the label, and the label does the work of making her the victim and you the problem, without requiring any honest examination of what actually happened. Controlling, bully, narcissist, emotionally unavailable. These are not descriptions of who you are, they are tools, deployed specifically to maintain a narrative that places her in the position of someone being wronged rather than someone who needs to be accountable. And they work, because you are a man who cares about being a good husband, which means the accusation that you are not lands in a place that takes it seriously, which means you defend yourself, which means you are now inside the frame she constructed rather than standing outside of it, asking whether the frame is accurate. The defense is the trap. Every time you defend yourself against a label, You have accepted that the label is a legitimate description of something that happened, rather than a tactical deployment designed to avoid accountability. Name what the label is doing. Do not defend yourself against it. The third thing to understand is the accounting that is running inside her head and why it will never balance in your favor. She is keeping score, continuously, with a specific and consistent methodology that is designed to produce only one outcome. Her contributions are tracked carefully, noticed, given full weight, sometimes inflated beyond what they actually represent. The things she does for the family and the household and the relationship are always present in her ledger, always available to be cited, always enough to establish that she is doing everything. Your contributions are tracked differently. Some are not tracked at all. The income you earn, the things you fix, the problems you solve, the ways you show up that are so consistent they have become invisible. These do not register as contributions because they have become the expected baseline rather than the evidence of effort they actually represent. Some are dismissed. You are just doing what you're supposed to do, as if meeting your responsibilities generates no credit, because meeting responsibilities is the minimum and minimums do not count. Some are actively minimized. Anyone could do that. That is not as hard as what I do. What you contribute is less demanding, less valuable, less worthy of acknowledgement than what she contributes. The result of this accounting is always the same. She is doing everything. You are doing little or nothing. And her suffering at the hands of a man who does not appreciate or support her makes complete sense when measured against the ledger she has constructed. The problem is not the accounting. The problem is that the methodology was chosen specifically to produce that result. And no amount of doing more will change the result because the methodology adjusts to ensure that what you do is never quite enough to close the gap. This is why trying harder does not work. It is not that your harder is insufficient. It is that the accounting system was designed to record your harder as the new minimum while adding new categories of deficit to ensure the gap remains. The fourth thing to understand is the moving target and why it moves specifically when you get close to it. You remember the complaint, you addressed it, you genuinely changed something about your behavior or your contribution or the way you showed up in the relationship. You did the work and something shifted, not in the direction of acknowledgement or appreciation or the reduction of tension that genuine improvement should produce. A new complaint appeared in a different area with the same intensity as the previous one, as if the previous one had never been addressed at all. This is not accidental, and it is not irrational in the way it might appear. It is the completely predictable behavior of a psychology that requires ongoing grievance to maintain a specific internal narrative. If you fully satisfied her, if you addressed every complaint and met every standard and eliminated every deficit she has identified, she would be left with a genuinely good husband providing a genuinely good life. And a genuinely good husband providing a genuinely good life cannot be the villain in her story. He cannot be the source of her suffering. He cannot be the explanation for why she is not as happy as she believes she deserves to be. So the target moves, not because she consciously decides to move it, but because the part of it that needs ongoing grievance to function adjusts automatically, finds the new deficit, focuses the narrative there, ensures that there is always something you are failing at so that the conclusion never has to change. You are not chasing a standard. You are chasing something that is designed to stay just out of reach, regardless of how fast you run. The fifth thing to understand is the support structure that makes this pattern so difficult to interrupt. She does not maintain this narrative alone. She has help. Her friends receive her version of events and respond with the automatic validation that female friendship often provides. Nobody questions whether her characterization is accurate. Nobody asks what you are experiencing. Nobody wonders whether the husband being described as failing her might have a perspective worth hearing. She tells her story and the response is, "You deserve better. He needs to do more. You are not wrong for feeling this way." Her therapist, if she has one, works from her account of the marriage, with genuine care and genuine professional skill aimed at helping a woman who presents as a suffering partner in a difficult marriage. The therapist does not know you. does not hear your account, works from what is brought into the room. And what is brought into the room is the victim narrative with all its distortions intact. Social media provides a constant feed of content that validates exactly the framework she is operating from, telling her that her needs are valid, that she deserves to be happy, that a woman who is not happy in her marriage is a woman being failed by her husband. The algorithm learns what she engages with and provides more of it, and what she engages with confirms what she already believes. The entire support structure is oriented toward validation of her narrative and away from examination of its accuracy. And so the narrative becomes harder and harder to challenge because it is not just internally held, it is externally reinforced by every person and every platform she turns to. You are not just disagreeing with her perception of events, you are disagreeing with a consensus that her entire social world has built around her account of who you are. Sixth thing to understand is what the pattern is doing to you beneath the surface of trying to manage it daily. You are absorbing something that does not announce itself as damage while it is happening. Every day inside a marriage where you are the villain in her story is a day of carrying a specific and sustained weight. The weight of being seen inaccurately by the person whose perception of you matters most. Of doing your best in a context where your best is systematically reframed as inadequacy, of trying to reach someone who has decided that being reached by you is evidence of your control rather than evidence of your love. This weight does not produce visible wounds. It produces something quieter and more insidious. It produces a man who has started to believe the verdict, who has absorbed enough of the narrative that he has begun to question whether the character being described might actually be him, who has spent so long defending himself against accusations that he has lost touch with the clear internal knowledge of who he actually is and what he is actually doing. It produces a man who has stopped trusting himself, whose judgment about his own behavior has been so consistently challenged that he no longer holds his own position with confidence, who brings less of himself into every interaction because bringing himself fully into the relationship keeps producing the accusation that what he brought was the problem. And it produces a man who is tired in a way that rest does not fix. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been trying to earn a verdict that was never going to change, regardless of the evidence presented. That exhaustion is not weakness. It is the natural result of sustained psychological pressure applied to a man who cared too much about the wrong person's assessment of who he is. The seventh thing to understand is how to stop participating in a dynamic that is destroying you. And I want to be precise about what I mean by stop participating, because this is not about becoming cold or aggressive or punishing. It is about something much simpler and much more difficult than either of those things. It is about naming what you see without defending yourself against it. When she deploys a label designed to reframe a reasonable action as evidence of a character flaw, do not defend the action. Name what the label is doing. That is not a description of what happened. That is a way of avoiding the actual conversation we need to have. When she positions a reasonable expectation as an attack on a victim, do not defend the expectation. Name the positioning. I am not attacking you. I am asking you a question that any partner in a functional marriage would be asked. The question is reasonable. The framing of it as an attack is not. And the accounting produces the familiar conclusion that she is doing everything and you are doing nothing. Do not provide an accounting of your own contributions. Name what the accounting is designed to produce. I am not going to participate in a conversation where everything I contribute is invisible and everything I ask for is evidence of my failure. That is not a conversation. That is a verdict being read with different words each time. Naming the pattern rather than defending against it removes you from the defensive position she needs you to occupy, because the defensive position keeps you inside her frame. And her frame was built to ensure that nothing you say from inside it can challenge the conclusion she has already reached. Step outside the frame, name the frame, and do not apologize for naming it. The eighth thing to understand is the boundary that changes everything. You are not required to accept being treated poorly by someone who has decided you deserve it. That sentence sounds simple. It is not simple to live because everything in you that wants to be a good husband, that wants to maintain the marriage, that wants to believe the dynamic can change if you just find the right approach, pulls against it. But it is true, and living it is the only thing that has a genuine chance of changing anything. When the disrespect arrives, when the label is deployed, when the treatment reflects the verdict she has reached about who you are allowed to say directly and without apology that you will not accept it. Not as a punishment, not as a threat. As the simple and clear statement of a man who knows the difference between a partner who is frustrated and expressing it badly in a human moment and a pattern of treatment that reflects a settled conclusion about his character. I will not have this conversation while being spoken to this way. When you are ready to talk about this without the labels, I am here. That boundary will not be welcomed. The pattern depends on your willingness to absorb what it delivers without naming it or limiting it. Your refusal to absorb disrupts the pattern, and disruption of the pattern produces escalation before it produces anything else. Hold anyway, because the escalation is not evidence that you made the wrong call. It is evidence that you made exactly the right one. Systems escalate when their resource base withdraws. Your willingness to absorb was the resource. Withdrawing it produces exactly the response you should expect. Hold through the escalation, calmly, without anger, without punishment, just without yielding. The ninth thing to understand is the hardest truth available in this conversation. Some women will choose the narrative over the marriage, not because they do not love their husbands in some genuine sense, but because the narrative has become more important to them than the relationship. More central to their identity, more essential to how they function psychologically than any individual relationship could be. When you name the pattern, when you set the boundary, when you stop playing the assigned role, a woman who is willing to examine the narrative honestly will eventually adjust. Not immediately, not without friction, but eventually the reality of a man who will not be the villain she needs will produce enough pressure on the narrative that something cracks in it. That crack is the beginning of something worth building. But a woman who is not willing to examine the narrative will escalate, will double down, will add new evidence to the existing case, will eventually choose the narrative over the relationship because losing the narrative feels more threatening than losing you. And that choice, while devastating, is the most clarifying information available. It tells you that the marriage was not primarily about partnership. It was about what you could be recruited to provide for a psychology that needed a specific kind of person in a specific kind of role. And the role was never going to change because the psychology that created it was never going to examine itself. You cannot logic someone out of a position they did not logic themselves into. You can only stop providing the conditions that make the position sustainable and see what that reveals about whether there's a genuine partnership underneath the narrative or whether the narrative was always the point. Here's what I want every man watching this to understand. Being a good husband is not the same as accepting every characterization of yourself that your wife offers. You can be a genuinely good man who is being genuinely mischaracterized. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. And accepting the mischaracterization in order to preserve the relationship is not an act of love. It is an act of self-erasure that destroys the man she married while trying to satisfy a narrative that was never actually about him. The man who names what he sees, who holds his own understanding of who he is against the pressure of a verdict that was decided without fair examination, who sets the boundary around his own dignity and does not move it regardless of what that costs in the short term. That man is not being a bad husband. He is being the only kind of husband worth being, the one who refuses to disappear into someone else's story about who he is. Because a man who has disappeared into that story has nothing real left to bring to the marriage, and a marriage built on his disappearance was never a marriage worth preserving. You deserve to be seen accurately by someone who is genuinely trying to see you. And if you are not receiving that in the marriage you are in, the most important question available to you is not, how do I get her to see me differently? It is whether a marriage where you are never seen accurately is a marriage worth the cost of staying in. That question deserves a genuinely honest answer. I want to hear from the men watching this. Are you living inside the dynamic I described? The one where doing everything right produces the verdict that you are the problem. Where the label arrives before the conversation. Where nothing you do is ever quite enough to change the conclusion that was reached before you even tried. Tell me in the comments, not as a performance of your pain, because the men reading this right now are carrying something in silence that they have not been able to name. And your experience named clearly is the thing that tells them they are not alone and they are not wrong. Share this if it said something true. This is Miss Alice, and I will be back with more of what nobody else will say. Subscribe if you are ready to keep hearing it.